Okay, so let's start. Welcome everyone to our first roundtable from IREB and ISAQB. And as you know, because you have registered for this today's roundtable, the main topic of today will be on requirements engineering meets software architecture. So with having these two disciplines in focus, we will address how the cooperation between both a requirements engineer and a software architect will work in practice today, and also where some improvement may is needed, especially with documentation, quality requirements, and so on. That's why we decided for the next 60 minutes, we have a nice discussion with Rainer and Gernot, and we will address several topics. One aspect is focusing on requirements engineering and software architecture in agile settings. As you know, many organizations are going to agile now. We will also come to the point of quality requirements because they are a driver for the software architecture. And we will also discuss topics about continuous development, lack of documentation, and so on. So, and in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we will have an open discussion. So I will open the microphone so you can raise your hand and I will give you the voice and you can directly talk to Rainer and Gernot to involve you into our discussion. If you have meanwhile a question during the discussion, please just use the chat and ask your question. I will try to push this question towards Rainer and Gernot so that we will directly can answer your point. If not, we will at least answer it in the very end. The session will be recorded, so we still started the recording, and the recording will be made available for everyone via YouTube. We will join the, we will share the recorded presentation via email, so you can also have a look into the presentation afterwards. And you are, we would be happy if you will share the presentation or the video recording afterwards as well. So, as mentioned, happy welcome or very welcome from my side. So I'm happy to welcome our panelists as well. On the one hand, it's Gernot Starke. He's the one who is, I think, a well-known expert in software architecture. He's founder and co-founder of ARC42 and AIM42. He has written numerous of books on the topic of architecture. He's member of the ISAQB, and he's also still working in the topic of software architecture as a consultant coach. And may I hand over to you, Gernot, to just give a brief intro from your perspective.
A big thank you to you, Stan. You already said everything that could be said. I am really happy to have the chance of discussing the disciplines, requirements, and architecture, because there should be no architecture without requirements, but in reality there is. And I'm really astonished, since several years astonished about that, so I'm looking forward. Let me add, Stan, I'm talking to you from Cologne in Germany, and please excuse everybody my lousy English. I didn't speak any English for the last couple of months because I currently have only German consulting assignments. If there is any problem with my language, just mention it in the chat and Stan will observe that.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Gernot. And the other panelist, it's Rainer Grau. I think he has his roots in requirements engineering. I think he was one of the first members at the IREB Association, and currently he's also member of the board of directors at IREB. He's also working since years in requirements engineering. Currently, he's also heavily engaged in enterprise agility, lean organizations, leadership in industry, and so on in different domains. And may I just hand over to you, Rainer, to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Welcome all. First of all, my English is as lousy as yours, Gernot. So sorry about that. Actually, Stan, my career started as a software developer.
Okay.
and I was about 15 years a hardcore software developer, even developing operating system software. So at least I have a slight clue of an idea what software development still is. Then I went to different areas over architecture as well, went to requirements engineering, as you said, but my core business now is scaling agility and business agility and organizational and corporate development in where I'm acting as an external consultant for many of our clients. I'm co-owner of this company, Pragmatic Solutions, where we do this for a set of clients. My location is Zurich. My core place of work, my core region is the German part of Switzerland. So now I hand back to you, Stan.
Perfect. Thank you, Rainer. So that's the part of the introduction. I think now we are coming to the really interesting part, the discussion about how requirements engineering and architecture fit together, where the both disciplines, where the interfaces between them and what needs to be done by a requirements engineer, what by an architect, and so on. And I would like to start with a topic that's, I think, really everywhere today, because each and every company is currently moving in a more agile way of working, into agile frameworks, using agile frameworks. Doesn't matter if, let's say, quite simple as Scrum or in a scaled way of agile. But the question I'm interested in is, what is the impact on requirements engineering and software architecture work when focusing on these, let's say, agile frameworks? Is there something different than previously with, let's say, in plan-based processes? So this would be my first topic for today.
Will you start or should I start, Gernot?
Let me be impolite and grab for the flag and let me start.
Yeah.
As when you started the introduction, Stan, a few projects came to my mind that moved from some kind of planning, or planned or waterfallish processes to agile. And when introducing agile, they dropped all discipline. So they completely forgot about everything they learned the hard way about business analysis, requirements analysis, quality goals, whatsoever. And they made the developers jump into coding. And I was completely astonished.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my clients, how come that everything we learned in the last years vanished? And they told me, oh, we hired a lot of Scrum consultants and product owners, and they know what to do. And so I approached the Scrum consultants and product owners, external consultants, and asked them about lack of discipline and the discipline of requirements engineering, and it's probably good to have some requirements. And a few of those guys really told me that, oh yes, I just finished my Scrum training. I have no idea what we are doing here, but it's all written in the book and we follow what's written in the book. So Agile was introduced in a disastrous way and people tried to recover, but even now, years afterwards, still the requirements part is not well done from my perspective. So I struggle since years. It's not only one client, one customer I experienced this kind of thing. It's several. And since years, I struggle with lack of requirements and lack of requirements discipline.
Well, Gernot, I agree totally, but is this really a fault of what's something called the requirements engineering? Because when I look into the companies, then who overtook the steering? This has been done by business departments, so telling we want to go in this direction, but they are very abstract and very analytical, very well, vision thinking, not concrete enough to create a piece of software or to create a solution for a customer. And on the other hand, the people who overtook are the architects. So if I look now in companies, architects have the steering about the development. I know some companies, they say, well, we have, for example, documentation, but documentation as code. So they document the code, but that's not sufficient to drive a business.
Definitely.
And now
Definitely.
the discipline of requirements engineering is anywhere in between in the sandwich and has no chance to get up, because architects have a lot of power in companies, the business has a lot of power, and all the other disciplines that are required. And it's not only requirements engineering, it's as well customer centricity. It's always user experience. These are just faded away, and the competence are not acknowledged anymore. There are a lot of requirements engineering or business analysts in companies that are now just writing user stories. So they are degraded down to user stories. And it's not only the lack of these people, it's not only the lack of these, let's say, unpolite scrum masters that you mentioned, but it's as well the part that business and architects overtook the steering and give no chance for the other competences. Actually, if they want to have requirements, they have to ask for, where are the requirements engineers? How do I get them? Is there any process now in this agile way of working that gives us requirements on that level that we needed? What do you say for this?
Yeah, I'm really, I think your perception is really interesting. And hopefully not all architects are unaware of the necessity for deep and intense requirements engineering. I don't want to advertise ISAQB here. I am a member, a founding member, and I hope the education is all right. And within the last years, we put a strong emphasis to educate software architects so that they know that the discipline of requirements engineering is important, and they have some clues that not only user stories, but also qualities with acceptance criteria and external interfaces and all that stakeholder analysis should be important. But I can imagine that if the wrong people take over, that they drop things they don't like or they don't value. And if that happens, we really have a big problem. And I'm completely with you. The situation is not good enough, in at least in several organizations I know. It's interesting that you have similar experiences.
One question from my side, maybe. Do you think this, let's say, the way how people work, and if the, let's say, documentation of requirements is really, let's say, valued by the others, and the work of a requirements engineer is valued? Do you think this is different today in agile settings, or it's more, let's say, complicated and more kind of not given than in plan-based settings?
Well, I would say yes, because you know, Agile told that documentation is of less value than code. That's okay, but sometimes it's mistreated as no documentation at all.
Yes,
true.
And this is the big fault. As I mentioned, now we have a lot of documentation as code. But if you go for an end-to-end process, an end-to-end business process with all the aspects, you never get it out of the documentation as code. No chance. You need this overview. And this is especially a part that gets totally lost. So if you go back, I just had a real example now. There's a migration from an old technology into a new microservice technology and microservice architecture. Very nice. A little bit too fine-grained, but it's another part of the story. But now they're looking in the old systems, and there's nothing anymore that tells how the processes are running. What are the regulations by FINMA or by GDPR that are implemented in the software? I don't find the business rules that are implemented anyhow. So a lot of knowledge just get lost.
And if I may interrupt you briefly, Rainer, what you are describing, I call a classic nowadays. It's a classic issue in migration to any new technology, whether it's microservice or self-contained or whatever. It's the complete lack of what is the old system, the system supposed to do. We know what's coded in source code, but we have no clue whether what's coded is still important, is still valid. So there are some business rules, probably some business functions. We have no idea if any user is still using it. So we are in some kind of dense mist. We hope that the existing source code supports the current requirements. So we translate everything we have into some new technology. And I'm completely with you. That's bound for disaster.
Yeah, but what I see now is that architects don't care for this now because they are in that problem. Because they are always very often building platforms, functional platforms with subject matter know-how in there. So like insurance regulations or FDA regulations or whatever you may. So compliance is as well often in the platform, and architects are building the platform, but they don't document what's in the platform as capabilities of the platform. And these capabilities are absolutely required to improve and develop the system over time.
Yeah.
But otherwise you do re-engineering.
That's a quite fascinating observation, and now I'm pointing towards my ARC42 badge behind me, because this architecture documentation template or proposal actually contains numerous parts reserved for requirements and capabilities. So if architects don't write up what the required or implemented capabilities are, then they are missing part of their job. Then they are doing not their job not right.
But then I'm pointing on the education of architects. And isn't that your part, Gernot?
Yeah, that is my part. And
yeah.
I hope that I made a lot of architects also write up their requirements. Actually, I'm currently in several coaching or consulting projects where exactly this this mix between architecture and requirements is an important topic. So part of my job currently is cleaning up behind this. We have to code quickly, and we didn't write up any capabilities, requirements, whatever. And then comes Gernot, the cleaner, and tries to help in that situation. And that's why I said it's a classic.
But then I would recommend architects as well should care for this topic.
Yeah, definitely.
An example, I was investing a lot of motivation and engagement into a company to build up a community of practice for requirements engineering and business analysis. It needed about 2 years that it got accepted and up to running with a job to define an accepted way how to do requirements engineering, how to document requirements engineering, and the support of the architects was low, actually. So when we go into the future, I would be happy to get more support in this building up community of practices, the mean in an agile environment to build up competence and to get a face to a competence.
Yeah.
How many companies do you know where a community of practice and requirements engineering is really alive?
I have to admit, it's not many. There are several typical or classical mistakes I encounter, and the lack of requirements engineering as a discipline is one of them, definitely. And whoever is responsible, I don't want to point my finger at certain roles or people, but I know there is still work to be done in educating development teams that requirements are valuable in the long run and not only in the short run until the end of the iteration or phase. Because even next year or in 2 years, there will be people asking the question, what's the system supposed to do?
Yeah.
And I cannot hand out the source code and tell people have a look at the code, and because that's not telling the truth.
Yeah. Maybe one question here. There's one in the chat. I will come to this in a second. But we are now talking about, let's say, issues that we face, especially with architecture and requirements in agile settings. Do you have an idea what should be improved? For sure, what I understood is what is still needed. This is also my perspective because we are praying this every day. Also in agile settings, the kind of requirements engineering is needed, especially also for the architecture. Let's say you have someone who's let's say working on requirements. Is there anything else what you have, or are there, let's say, any projects where you say this has worked very well and this is, let's say, a good kind of, let's say, approach for other projects?
Actually, yes. I would say if you care about abstraction levels of requirements in companies, then you could succeed in building up a common understanding. What I mean with the abstraction levels, you have the strategy, you have capabilities. There is one question in the chat, how would you document the capabilities in an agile way? And capabilities drive processes, business processes. Business processes are typically now in the agile understanding an end-to-end process from customer to customer, now where you need these capabilities. And an end-to-end process you could, on a lower abstraction level, document, for example, with BPMN use cases, for example. And use cases then could be the starting point to identify features on products and services. And with these features of products and services, you could feed development organization so that they know how to implement then features of their product and services. So product owners could decide, these are my set of features and services, and this is their set of features. That could be an abstraction level that you have to build up and motivate and engage in the company. And then you have a business architecture with these capabilities, with these end-to-end processes, with these BPMN use cases that fit together and build up the knowledge of the business knowledge, the business part of knowledge. What would you say to this, Gernot?
Actually, it's the perfect description of what I envision to be a nice and pragmatic approach to requirements. I liked your initial term of the hierarchy. What I noticed in several of my clients or project situations is the lack. Let me start over. What I find is an enormous number of detailed information of low level, let me call that features. So I have literally hundreds of yellow sticky notes attached to a wall or to a Miro board or whatever, but I have no clear vision, no strategy, no capabilities, no overview of the business processes.
Yeah.
So I notice the lack of higher level abstractions. So the bird's eye perspective, actually, this is often pretty easy to describe because it's not 150 pages, it's 2 or 3 or maybe 5 pages or wiki pages or some diagrams. It's not much work, but it's very important work to be able to attach the details to some higher abstraction.
Yeah. And this is the difference to classical documentation, because classical documentation was way too detailed and out of the chance to get maintained.
Yeah.
With these lightweight descriptions, more graphical descriptions, they are very stable and lightweight to maintain. And that's the key to success.
Yeah, that's a strategy we follow in the ARC42 architecture description too, is focus on higher level abstractions to avoid overly detailed documentation that gets outdated pretty quickly.
Right, yeah.
And interesting is that it works for both requirements and architecture. So once you coach a team, you teach a team how to document in a more abstract way, they can apply this abstraction to both their technical architecture stuff and to requirements.
There's a nice question in the chat. When software architecture and requirements engineering overlap in some areas, how to avoid conflicts and redundancies? From my point of view, if you go to capabilities, that's a good idea to get a valuable discussion about this distinction, because a lot of non-functional and quality requirements are in the architecture. So the architecture, the system architecture builds up some cross-cutting concerns like security, performance, transferability, all these ilities that are actually in the ISO norms. And if you discuss about capabilities, then you could say some of these capabilities are part of architecture and some of the capabilities are rather on the client or customer side. So they build up customer centricity or this customer orientation, these functional processes for the end-to-end process. And if you then discuss about capabilities, could say this capability is rather in the domain of architecture and this capability is rather in the domain developing an user solution and end user solution. And this discussion should be done with architects and nowadays POs, business owners, product owners.
That was the part I was currently missing in your explanation. So I liked everything you said, and I really think this last sentence is the most important one. You have to come together. The question was how to avoid a conflict.
Yeah.
The first thing is I have to identify that conflict, if there is a conflict, and I can only identify a conflict if we talk to each other. So we want to collaborate on requirements and architecture. Collaborate means I need more than one person to do that. And I need the business owners, I need the product owners, the product people responsible for the product. I need technical know-how, probably even more from the testing side, from legal, whatever other stakeholders are involved. And I need these people to work together. So no discipline, neither requirements nor architecture should be done by just a single person locked up in their room. So I want these people to work together. And that's one approach I like to take, get the people in brief time scheduled discussion. So take an hour, take half an hour, discuss a potential capability, a business process, whatever, and then identify, do we have a conflict? Do we need to update our documentation, whatever? But collaboration is key for me.
Right, yeah. A good example would for authentication and authorization. To implement this, you may need an identity and access management concept. So anybody has to define roles. These roles are typically defined by business who is using the software. Then the roles has to be implemented. There has to be some means, some IT components that implement the access layer based on an Active Directory. And then the access is developed by a team based on the roles, but the roles are defined by the business. So
hopefully.
these business, hopefully, yes. This is a very, very nice example how these different roles should work together.
Yeah. Maybe one. I think there's another nice. There are many questions. Meanwhile, there's another nice question which brings me at least to one of our next topics. We slightly addressed this anyhow. The topic of quality requirements, because they are really a driver for software architectures. Rainer already came to it when answering one of the last or previous questions. I think here is another question. Is requirements engineering concerned with trade-offs in quality requirements, or does it only shape clients' needs objectively? just gives us for your discussion.
Actually, quality and everything around product and system quality is one of my professional hobbies since a couple of years, and I will paste a link in the chat. We started, or actually I started a little project because I am not happy with the current approaches to handling software quality. And I currently consider the ISO standard being not good enough to really help projects to describe what kind of quality they really need. The ISO standard doesn't say anything about acceptance criteria. The terminology is a bit outdated. It's lacking.
You mean the 2025?
25010.
Yep.
There was no safety. There is safety in a draft, but there is nothing about deployment, energy efficiency. So it's okay-ish, but it's not good. And I invest lots and lots of time in both in training and consulting to talk with teams about required qualities. The business functions, the functional requirements are often good enough because the business people can explain what they are doing from an activity or functional standpoint. But when it comes to qualities, the typical illities, things get a bit more difficult. And from ARC42, this framework is probably quite well known in the architecture and solution space. We decided that we should do something, and so we started collecting ideas, simple pragmatic ideas how to handle quality. And I think that should be homework for every development team to make sure that we get the quality requirements right.
But a little observation, Gernot. Companies like to implement features. Give me more features. And actually, software developers like to implement features, not quality illities. And I had one observation in the company where we really cared for cybersecurity and compliance requirements. So that should be at least acknowledged and treated constantly through the process of development. And then we identified that something would be nice that at least, so these T-shirt workers, in the team, there is some security knowledge as well in the team, would be nice. So there are at least some people who understand what quality requirements are and how to implement and test that stuff, because some are part of an audit trail as well. And well, then we gathered all those teams and we asked, please raise your hand if you are interested in security and quality requirements. Could you imagine how many hands have been lifted?
Security might be a very bad example for lifting hands because nobody likes it.
Actually, that was the part. 2 hands lifted up out of about 100.
Yeah. It would be a little different if you would have asked for probably scalability or some cool web feature where we roll out our system to 1 million users. That's probably more interesting. But yes, I'm with you. It's not, there is not enough focus on this quality topics. And
but if you think about ransom and all that stuff that's coming out to you, that's quite important.
Yes, it is.
And if I see the projects right now, it's neglected all day through the development. And in the end, just right before deployment, there's a question, did you think about security? And then the deployment stops for 3 months until all these issues are fixed.
Yeah. My take on this quality is I'm I'm watching quality from the architecture, from the solution point of view. And I have some clients that have highly specific quality requirements. For example, in web space, in online systems, the capacity of systems, the performance, throughput, scalability is important. And these topics are tracked. So in one of my clients, I can't disclose which one, but they have performance engineers within the teams. So the topic performance is in the conscious decision-making process. So everybody knows we must not implement anything that's hindering our performance. And it took some while to get these performance guys accepted. They also have security guys, which are not as accepted as the performance guys because security is not as interesting as performance. But if companies or projects put enough focus on these quality topics, it turns out that the systems fulfill these requirements. For me, it's completely obvious that if you put a focus on something, you can manage that. But somebody and requirements and architects should collaborate in this field. Somebody should care for the broad topic of quality because it's not only performance and security. There is much, much more.
Yeah.
As you said, it's legal, it's ethics, it's energy efficiency, it's whatever. It's more than 100 of these terms around in our domain, and we have to care for those.
Yeah.
And that's a topic where, from my point of view, both the IREB and ISAQB needs to continue working on. So it's both educating requirements engineers, business analysts, and architects and developers to add quality to the features they implement.
Actually, we are thinking about this.
Absolutely.
Stan, now you could say some words. We are thinking about this, discussing about quality requirements in the IREB.
Exactly. So we are currently thinking about, let's say, handling quality requirements for sure. This is somehow also covered in our current examinations, but not in this detail. And Rainer recently published an article in the RE magazine on handling quality requirements in scaled agile frameworks, especially on, let's say, how to, I think it's more on the process thing on what needs to be done in agile settings to handle such kind of, let's say, quality and also requirements that need to be audited in a certain way.
Yeah. Actually, there's a question right here in the chat now. In addition to software architecture and requirements engineering, should we also consider other specialties such as project management? Well, is project management still the right term, is my first question. The other question is yes, if you interpret project management like the operating model of the development system in a company, then I would say yes.
Yeah, definitely. It's not the only roles that have steering capabilities. So requirements can steer a project in some direction, architecture can, but there is more that has to be decided. And
right, yeah.
As an architect, I usually don't have the money to decide anything. I cannot hire additional people for the project. I cannot buy additional cloud instance, whatever. I have to ask somebody, which was in former times some project management person. Nowadays, it's often the product owner, but there is some other organizational role needed. Yeah. Apart from requirements and architecture.
Or to be more concrete, out there, for all those who are listening now to our discussion, I guess a lot of you are now working with a safe, scaled agile framework as the process model adopted in the company. How good or how bad this is adopted in a company is another story, but at least SAFe is talking as well, again, about abstraction levels. You have this abstraction levels of the portfolio epics, you have the abstraction level of features, and you have the abstraction levels on teams for user stories. And you should care for that quality requirements and functional requirements are treated equally on all these levels. And typically, if we look into companies, if what is really cared for are the functional requirements, and the quality requirements are neglected on these levels. They come afterwards. And right in the beginning, you should integrate this discussion about the quality requirements on these abstraction levels. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah,
and I think there's one additional point, because I'm just looking at the time as well. I think there's one major important point, in addition to, let's say, that at the IREB and at the ISAQB, we need to consider, let's say, both aspects on, let's say, quality requirements. Requirements need to be available for architects and so on. But we're talking about people, and I think one major thing is that requirements engineers and architects, they need to have this mindset that they need to work with each other, that they need to talk to each other, because both of them can improve really the quality of the project. There are several hints coming from, in my what I have often experienced. I really liked it to discuss very early also in the project with architects and with architects, to see which capabilities are available, what needs to be done, what needs to be considered, because this has direct influence to my requirements, and also not only to quality aspects, but sometimes also to functional aspects that I need to discuss with the business departments afterwards, because there may be some restrictions based on architecture and so on.
And to be concrete as well, when I go into a company and caring for requirements engineering, then I'm looking around and search for a community of practice and requirements engineering. Is there any, or is there nothing like this? And then I observe this community of practice is more a country club atmosphere, just a few people talking with each other and having a nice time. Or do they have the right, for example, to recommend good practices for requirements engineering in the company? That's the next maturity level. And if they really have the right to define good practices and recommend good practices, and maybe even quasi standards that are used all in the company, then you're on a high maturity. And if you talk about people, this is the chance to get the discussion about requirements engineering into a company, to build up such a community of practice, because then architecture have a counterpart for a discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a slight suspicion, Rainer, that you find these community of practices in companies you work with because you are hired by companies that value requirements engineering at least a little bit. And I am working with several companies that don't use any scaled frameworks, that do not care for a lot of development methodology, and that focus a lot on the pure engineering parts. And that's where probably there should be way more education in processes, in methods, and in requirements.
Right.
They are very fit. The people are very fit, educated in technologies, but they don't follow the recommendations you gave about hierarchies, whatever.
Actually, that should be integrated into an education for product owners and business owners.
There was a question from Maria. She is asking, what's your take on event storming as a workshop format to elicit requirements as an end-to-end process for requirements engineers and architects?
She speaks from my heart, Maria. Thank you very much for that question.
Yeah.
Rainer, is it okay if I move forward?
Yes.
Actually, event storming is pretty often done in the context of a method called domain-driven design.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There is this design word in the method name that's, from my point of view, incomplete, because domain-driven design is actually domain-driven requirements and design. So this event storming is purely requirements engineering work. I don't design anything. I don't choose technologies. I don't choose a cloud provider, whatever. I understand business and stakeholder requirements. And we can enhance event storming with quality, which would be a good thing because in the original event storming quality is not mentioned, but every practitioner probably adds quality discussions to that event storming, but it's a great format. It's a great workshop format, which can be the some kind of key beginning of a documentation. The yellow sticky notes on the wall are no documentation, but it's a beginning.
Yeah,
and
because out of the event storming, you could draw out a BPMN, for example, for the process.
Yeah.
And you could derive a story map. And with a story map, you could steer your development direction.
And if you step back far enough from a event storming wall, you have the bird's eye perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You can, as you said, you can draw a BPMN, a process diagram, if you step back far enough.
Right. Yeah.
So you shouldn't copy all these low-level details in a diagram. That's probably not worth creating such a huge thing. But stepping back, we already mentioned a few times this hierarchy, abstraction levels.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a good point.
And that is, I think, the point when we're talking about, let's say, continuous development and documentation and so on, that we need documentation, but it should be
may I interrupt
lean enough. Yeah.
May I interrupt for just probably a final sentence concerning our quality topic?
Sure.
I have read every quality model, quality standard that's available on the planet. So that was very boring. I lost many hairs in that process. And they are all using nouns to describe desired properties. So I wondered, why didn't they use adjectives instead of nouns?
Mm-hmm.
So they are talking about flexibility, but the people I talk to, they want the system to be flexible. So they are using adjectives. That's probably you think this is just nitpicking, but I think words are a strong tool for the mind. So in this website, I put the link in. I propose to use adjectives instead of nouns to start a discussion. That's far easier at least for business people, for business stakeholders, to start a discussion about desired properties of systems or processes, whatever. Just a side note.
Yeah.
So Stan, excuse me for the interruption.
No
you
worries.
wanted to move on to the next topic and I interrupted you.
Yeah. So next topic, but I think we should make this as short as possible because we are more or less running out of time with these interesting discussions. Last topic was on the documentation part, but we already addressed documentation meanwhile several times. And what I got out of the discussion is that for sure we have an issue with documentation currently, but it's not only in Agile, but it was also before. Before we may had documents that were way too heavy. Now we have no documentation at all, and we need something in the middle, something in between, where we have a kind of structured documentation. We have some hierarchies, and we have some, let's say, some lightweight descriptions that could be used for architecture as well. Is this right?
Absolutely, yes.
Absolutely.
I would say that's absolutely right. What I would recommend is that you, beside the code as part of the documentation, to care for a repository with explicit identified abstraction levels, and that you say what would be the diagram technique or whatever you like to use for a certain abstraction level. And these abstraction levels should fit into each other, like business capabilities, end-to-end processes, user stories, and then you are on the code. Yeah? And if you decide to have these descriptions lightweight, then you get out of this maintenance nightmare. And it's easy to maintain these. And even with capabilities, you could build up an agile organization, because nowadays in the idea of an agile organization, a team or a teams of teams, a squad or an art, however you like to name it, is responsible for a set of business capabilities, to develop business capabilities. And then you have the discussion right here on these capabilities. Go this in direction functional requirements or quality requirements, and you have the discussion between architects and requirements engineers or business analysts, however you would like to call them. Yeah. And that would be a good idea to build up the system of documentation, at least from my point of view. And then you have a lightweight repository of your business knowledge.
That's lightweight is a nice term. Another would be pragmatic, probably.
Yeah.
And it should be the result of, again, collaboration between various roles, because if done right, architecture documentation needs some requirements information and will contain requirements information, but we don't want duplication. So it's a great idea if product owners, requirements engineers, requirements managers talk to each other and find ways how to extract the right abstraction levels for the architecture. Again, I point to the ISAQB template, and I have seen projects where things are done right, and they have a nice mixture of requirements documentation, maintainable requirements documentation, and they put excerpts of these into the architecture docs so the developers can understand the architecture docs without needing to resort to dozens and dozens of requirements. Especially in safety critical systems, the requirements should be documented extensively still today. That's absolutely needed because they have to ensure traceability, whatever. Then we need these abstractions for the architecture again.
Actually, this answers one question in the chat. Is it possible that requirements engineering uses the ISAQB template to fill in the boxes in relation to the requirements? Well, I would say you need anything additional to ISAQB, but that should be correlated, and these excerpts using, like Gernot recommended, would be a good way.
My ISAQB colleague Peter Ruschka is currently working on a thing called Rec 42, which is, I would call it a lightweight version of the pretty old and established Volere template. So there are requirements templates available, which can be used in very lightweight and agile manner. They can all be misused, but it's perfectly fine to use Volere in a lightweight manner. And I actually have projects that only use ISAQB and put their requirements on high-level abstractions within the ISAQB, although ISAQB is not made for requirements only.
Right. And if you step away from Word and PowerPoint to something that's valuable, like a wiki-alike repository, then you could have a network of links in between these different information types. And then you get rid of the redundancy of documentation.
Yeah. And this getting rid of redundancy and writing pragmatic and efficient/effective documentation needs some decisions how to do that. So it needs somebody knowledgeable in how we create documentation. So people should again collaborate and decide how shall we approach this documentation thing.
There's another interesting
there is no one
question
rule
in the chat about the language. Should we document in German or in English?
Yeah, it depends. Probably.
But that's a hard question in international. I don't have the right answer. I'm sorry. Depends on where the majority of the people are.
I had a nice engagement where a German company translated their business processes, business requirements into English, to send it to Hungary for implementation work or architecture work. And the Hungarians complained about the bad English, and they were all pretty fluent in German. So this translation was just adding complexity and being of no use.
Right.
If you sent it over to India, German would be more difficult, but there is no clear answer to that.
Right, yes.
Yeah. There's another question coming up with respect to a fixed architecture. So what if the architecture is already fixed and new requirements come up, future upgrade? How should a requirements engineer deal with such situation?
Well, this is the point of emerging architecture, Gernot.
Yeah.
Isn't this something beloved by you?
I have really a very bad feeling if I read that some architecture is fixed. I know that in embedded systems, where the complete system is burned into some integrated circuit and can never be modified, but this is just an instance of a system. So a future generation of such a system should be emerging, as you said, Rainer. So it should be able, we should be able as a development team to redecide, to readjust certain dependencies, decisions, update libraries, whatever. So
But there I have an interesting question. When I look back into history, then we had these monolithic applications. Then we re-engineer these into SOA applications. And what we created was a network of interconnected and dependent SOA services. I call this the next level of legacy.
Yes, a mess.
And
basically a mess.
And now we are on the mess of microservices. Is this just a growing architecture where a system grows until they are unmaintainable, no matter what technology you use? Or is emerging architecture something that is realistic, Gernot?
If you don't see any way out of any mess, what you could do is to borrow time, because the mess is so huge, and management wants new features, and you say, oh, I cannot deliver, but I propose some technology migration, and I need 2 more years, and after these 2 years, everything will be perfect, because we then have this XYZ architecture. And from my point of view, is a fairly large number of microservice migration projects did exactly that. They simply bought time. They will fail because if you have an undecipherable monolith in one runtime, it won't get any better if you do this remotely. So if you have distributed dependencies, it adds latency and costs you performance, so it's no better than before. But you bought yourself some time. So if we re-engineer, we should do it properly, starting from the business domain. So if we don't understand the business domain, we cannot re-engineer a system. No way.
So we are on the point again that we don't have a documentation of our system, so we don't know what to do. So we're starting from a white place.
Exactly.
And we take the existing source code and distribute that into microservice. That's a sure way to disaster.
Okay. Let me shortly sneak in, because we have at least reached end of our discussion. Nevertheless, before all the participants are leaving, I would like to thank all the participants for their questions. I hope we could answer at least several of them. There were a lot of discussion ongoing in the chat. We try to answer many of these questions. So if you like, I think we could spend another 5 minutes at least for everyone who's willing to stay. It's fine. Otherwise, I would really thank you, as participants, for your questions and for your attendance. And I would also like to thank Rainer and Gernot for the intensive and really lively discussion.